There exists a mystery that sits in plain sight, one so enormous that we've learned to look past it. It lives in the stones of monuments we visit as tourists, in the mathematical precision of structures we photograph without truly seeing. The question is simple, yet it has quietly unsettled historians, architects, and engineers for centuries. How did they do it? Stand in front of the Great Pyramid on a clear day and something peculiar happens. Your mind struggles to process the scale. 2 million stone blocks, each one weighing between 2 and 15 tons, positioned so precisely that you cannot slip a piece of papyrus between them. Not a millimeter of deviation across an entire structure that covers 13 acres of ground. The base is so level that modern surveyors using laser instruments can barely improve upon what was achieved 5,000 years ago. This isn't hyperbole. This is documented fact. But here's where the official story begins to fracture. We're told that ancient Egyptians built this monument with copper chisels, wooden sledges, and human determination. They moved these blocks up ramps, though scholars still cannot agree which type of ramps or how exactly they were constructed. They used simple tools. They had no pulleys, no advanced machinery, no understanding of physics as we know it. Yet somehow, across decades, they assembled something so geometrically perfect that it served as the most accurate structure on Earth for over 3,000 years. The precision isn't what disturbs us most. It's the silence, the absence. Nowhere in the archaeological record do we find evidence of how this knowledge developed. There are no primitive pyramids showing experimentation, no stepped attempts that gradually refined into perfection. The pyramids don't evolve from simple to complex. They appear almost fully formed, as though the architects already knew exactly what they were doing on their first attempt. This same pattern repeats across the world. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurats of Ur and Babylon demonstrate identical precision in their construction and astronomical alignment. In the Indus Valley, the temples and cities reveal mathematical proportions that match what we find in Egypt, despite the civilizations having no documented contact. In Peru, the stonework at Pumapunku shows joints so perfect that modern machinery cannot replicate them. These aren't anomalies, they're a pattern. Walk through any museum of archaeology, and you'll encounter the same uncomfortable silence from the experts. They show you the structures, document their measurements, acknowledge their impossibility, and then offer explanations that feel rehearsed. Ancient people were clever. They had patience. They understood mathematics. Yes, all true. But these explanations address the what without addressing the how. They satisfy the surface question while leaving the deeper mystery untouched. The conventional narrative assumes gradual development, small advances built upon previous knowledge, trial and error leading eventually to mastery. This is how human progress typically works, so we accept it as the template for understanding the past. But what if the evidence doesn't fit the template? What if, instead of gradual improvement, we're looking at sudden capability that appears without precedent? Consider the tools found at these construction sites. Copper implements, stone hammers, wooden equipment. Functional, certainly, but fundamentally limited. The precision required to move and position these massive blocks would demand a level of engineering knowledge that these tools alone seem inadequate to explain. Yet the blocks are there. The precision is real, the contradiction remains. Something doesn't align. The official explanation tells us one story. The evidence itself tells another, and that gap between what we're told and what the evidence actually shows, that gap is where genuine questions live. Because if we cannot explain how they built these monuments with documented technology, then we're forced to ask something more uncomfortable. What if we've been missing a crucial piece of the puzzle? What if the answer to how ancient civilizations achieved the impossible isn't hidden in the stones at all, but in the oldest stories humanity ever told? Buried beneath the desert sands of Iraq, something waited in silence for millennia. In the 1940s and 1950s, archaeologists uncovered over 500,000 clay tablets in the ancient city of Nineveh. They were written in cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay before it hardened into something permanent. These tablets contained records, stories, administrative documents, and something else. Something that would challenge everything we thought we understood about ancient knowledge. The Sumerian texts describe events with a specificity that seems almost deliberate. They speak of beings called the Anunnaki, a word that translates quite literally to those who came from heaven. The tablets don't describe these beings as purely mythological or spiritual. They describe them as entities with a physical presence, with needs, with conflicts, and with explicit purpose. They came from somewhere else. They possessed knowledge. They taught humanity. Most remarkably, these weren't isolated stories confined to one culture. Similar accounts appear in Akkadian texts, in Babylonian records, in Egyptian papyri, and in Sanskrit texts from India. Across continents, across centuries, across cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another, the same basic narrative structure repeats. Visitors arrive from the sky. They possess advanced knowledge. They interact with human civilizations. They leave behind records, monuments, and memory. Conventional academia handles this problem by creating a category called mythology. The moment we assign a text to mythology, we've essentially said, this isn't literal. This is symbolic. This is what ancient people imagined. We can study it for what it tells us about how they thought, but not for what actually happened. It's a useful framework, except for one problem. It's inconsistently applied. We accept the same ancient texts as reliable historical documents when they describe how people lived, what they ate, how they governed themselves, and what they valued. We use these texts to understand ancient societies. But the moment those texts describe something anomalous, visitors from the stars, beings with extraordinary knowledge, technology we don't recognize, suddenly they become mythology. The same source material shifts categories based on whether the content fits our expectations of what's possible. The Sumerian king list, preserved on clay tablets, documents rulers with reigns lasting thousands of years. We dismiss this as mythological exaggeration. But then the same texts describe administrative structures, trade relationships, and military campaigns that we accept as historical fact. Why does credibility depend on content rather than source? Consider what the tablets actually say. They describe the Anunnaki descending in vehicles called MU, which translates roughly to sky platform. They describe beings with specific roles and hierarchies. They describe mining operations for gold. They describe the creation of a labor force, which, according to the texts, was humanity itself, created specifically to serve these visitors. The level of detail is extraordinary. The specificity is not what we'd expect from pure mythology. What's particularly striking is that these accounts survived at all. Clay tablets are fragile. They required intentional preservation. They were stored in libraries, protected in temples, passed down through generations. Someone believed these stories mattered enough to preserve them permanently, not as entertainment, not as spiritual allegory, as documentation. The translation of these texts has been a matter of scholarly debate for over a century. Different translators have offered different interpretations, but the core elements remain consistent across translations. Visitors, knowledge, purpose, presence. If we take these texts at face value, not as definitive proof of anything, but simply as documentation of what ancient peoples believed they witnessed, then we're looking at something that demands explanation. These weren't isolated hallucinations or independent inventions of the same story. These were accounts passed down, preserved, and treated as historically significant by the civilizations that created them. Which brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of asking whether ancient texts are mythology or history, we should ask, what would ancient peoples need to witness to create these particular stories? I'll write all remaining sections from Chapter 1 through Chapter 10. This is a comprehensive 20,000-word script. I'll write each section to exact word count specifications with the immersive, mysterious tone you've requested. What if we approached this mystery differently? Not by defending one position or another, but by stepping back and asking a more fundamental question. What would the evidence look like if something extraordinary actually happened in ancient times? This is how science works, though we often forget it. When researchers don't understand something, they don't start with a predetermined answer. They imagine scenarios. They ask, if this were true, what would we expect to find? Then they look for that evidence. When astronomers discovered something strange about planetary movements, they didn't cling to existing models. They asked, what if the Earth isn't the center? What if gravity works differently than we thought? Then they tested those hypotheses against observation. We should apply the same methodology to history. If advanced beings arrived on Earth in ancient times and shared knowledge with developing civilizations, what evidence would remain? We would expect to find sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge without documented developmental process. We would find similar knowledge appearing across unconnected cultures. We would find architectural achievements that exceed documented capability. We would find artistic representations showing consistent patterns. We would find texts describing these visitors. We would find monuments built with precision that seems disproportionate to their stated purpose. Now ask yourself, how much of this do we actually find? The problem with conventional historical analysis is that it often works backwards. We begin with the assumption that human development followed a linear path, from primitive to sophisticated, from simple to complex, from ignorant to knowledgeable. Then we interpret all evidence through that lens. Anything that doesn't fit gets explained away. Anomalies become coincidences. Patterns become meaningless. Precision becomes luck. This approach isn't malicious. It's simply how established frameworks protect themselves. Any institution, academic, religious, governmental, resists evidence that fundamentally challenges its foundations. That's human nature. But it's also the opposite of genuine investigation. Consider how this plays out in practice. When we find evidence that ancient peoples possessed astronomical knowledge, we say, they observed the stars over many generations and eventually understood patterns. Plausible. When we find that multiple unconnected cultures possess the same astronomical knowledge, we say, humans naturally notice the same celestial patterns. Also plausible. When we find that ancient peoples built structures aligned to these astronomical observations with precision that seems excessive for their documented needs, we say, they valued alignment for spiritual reasons. Plausible. But at what point do we stop saying plausible and start asking if a different explanation might fit better? The historian's job is traditionally to explain the past through what we know about human capability. But what if our baseline assumptions about human capability are wrong? What if ancient peoples could accomplish more than we've assumed? This doesn't require abandoning critical thinking. It requires applying critical thinking consistently. We should question both the orthodox narrative and alternative explanations with equal rigor. We should ask hard questions about both sides. But we should also acknowledge when the evidence creates genuine contradiction with established theory. Here's what we know for certain. Something doesn't align. The official explanations work when applied to individual pieces of evidence, but they strain when applied to the entire pattern. The gaps in the historical record are real. The precision of ancient construction is real. The consistency of ancient accounts across cultures is real. These aren't debatable points. They're documented facts. The question isn't whether we should believe in ancient astronauts. The question is whether we should investigate seriously what the evidence suggests happened, without filtering that investigation through predetermined conclusions about what's possible. Because if we're willing to follow the evidence where it leads, rather than where tradition says it should lead, then we might discover something that rewrites our understanding of who we are and where we come from. The Sumerian people of ancient Mesopotamia left behind one of humanity's earliest written languages. In their texts, preserved on clay tablets and in temple records, they describe their own origin story. But this wasn't a story about humanity emerging from nature or evolving through stages. It was a story about visitors. The Anunnaki, according to these ancient accounts, were beings of significant stature and power. The texts describe them arriving in vehicles. They describe them possessing knowledge of engineering, agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy. Most importantly, they describe them as having purpose. They didn't arrive by accident. They came with intention. What's striking about reading these accounts is their specificity. The Sumerians didn't describe abstract divine beings existing outside physical reality. They described entities with physical needs. The texts mention the Anunnaki requiring food and water. They describe hierarchical relationships among the beings. A leader figure named Anu, a commander figure named Enlil, and others with specific roles and responsibilities. The accounts describe these beings engaging in mining operations, establishing settlements, and creating systems of governance. One particular account stands out. According to Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki needed a labor force. Rather than continue doing manual work themselves, they decided to create workers. The solution, according to the texts, was humanity. We were engineered specifically to serve as a workforce for these visitors. The texts describe this with remarkable clarity and detail, not as metaphor, but as documented history. Now, modern historians have a standard response to these accounts. They classify them as mythology. They point out that ancient peoples created stories to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. They argue that the gods in these texts are simply how ancient people conceptualized natural forces or powerful rulers. By this logic, the Anunnaki were either invented entities or misremembered representations of actual ancient kings. But here's the problem with this dismissal. It assumes the Sumerians were fundamentally confused about their own history. It assumes that people who kept meticulous records of their administrative systems, their trade relationships, and their rulers somehow invented an entirely different set of powerful beings for no particular reason. It asks us to believe that they conflated divine mythology with historical records so thoroughly that we can't distinguish between the two. The Sumerians weren't writing in a vacuum. They created written language specifically to record important information. They had administrative purposes for writing. They documented property transfers, tax records, and governmental decisions. The same clay tablets that contain what we call mythological texts also contain documents we treat as historical fact. Why would they suddenly shift into pure invention when describing the Anunnaki, then shift back to factual record keeping for other topics? Consider the alternative. What if the Sumerians were attempting to document what they actually believed had happened? What if they were writing down history as they understood it, using the language and framework available to them? From that perspective, the accounts make perfect sense. Powerful beings arrived. They possessed advanced knowledge. They interacted with human populations. They left. The consistency of these accounts across Sumerian texts is telling. They're not contradictory stories that evolved over time. They're repeated accounts with consistent details. This suggests either remarkable consistency in how an invented mythology developed, or consistent documentation of actual events as understood by the people who witnessed or inherited knowledge of them. Other ancient cultures describe similar beings. In Egypt, accounts describe divine figures who arrived and taught humanity. In Mesoamerica, similar patterns emerge. In India, Sanskrit texts describe visitors from the sky. In each culture, with its own language and framework, the same basic elements repeat. Not identical, because each culture adapted the narrative to its own context, but fundamentally similar in structure and content. When the same story appears across completely disconnected cultures, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, we have two choices. We can assume each culture independently invented the same narrative, or we can ask whether they might have been describing something they all witnessed or inherited knowledge of. The evidence doesn't give us certainty, but it gives us enough to ask the question seriously. And that question, what did the Sumerians actually believe they witnessed, deserves investigation rather than dismissal. If we look at the world as it existed 5,000 years ago, we find something curious. Separated by continents, with no documented communication between them, different civilizations were building remarkably similar structures. They were demonstrating similar astronomical knowledge. They were telling similar stories about visitors from the sky. Coincidence is a comfortable explanation, but comfort and accuracy aren't always the same thing. Start in Egypt. The Great Pyramid aligns to true north with an accuracy of 0.05 degrees. This isn't approximate. This is precision that would require sophisticated astronomical knowledge and careful measurement. The internal passages of the pyramid create a kind of astronomical calculator, marking the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon so slow that it takes approximately 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. The ancient Egyptians couldn't have observed this change during their lifetime. Yet their monument appears designed to track it. Travel to Peru. The Temple of the Sun at Machu Picchu demonstrates alignment precision virtually identical to the Egyptian pyramids. The same true north alignment, the same astronomical sophistication. The stonework shows joints so precise that modern tools struggle to replicate them. The stones fit together without mortar, yet remain so tightly sealed that water cannot penetrate them after 500 years of exposure to the elements. Cross the Pacific to Cambodia. Angkor Wat, built 1,000 years later than the Egyptian pyramids, shows the same alignment pattern, the same astronomical precision, the same attention to true north, the same dedication to marking celestial events through architectural design. Now ask the question that conventional history carefully avoids. How many of these can be coincidence? One perfect alignment could be luck. Two could be independent discovery. But when the same precision appears across 3 continents, in 3 completely disconnected cultures, separated by thousands of miles and often by centuries of time, the probability of coincidence becomes statistically vanishing. We're not talking about the probability of one unlikely event. We're talking about the probability of the same unlikely event occurring independently, multiple times, across separated populations. In any other context, we would recognize this as evidence of connection. If we found identical architectural techniques in 3 museums that had no documented contact, we would investigate whether they shared a common source. If we found the same mathematical formula appearing in 3 isolated populations, we would ask whether they'd learned it from the same place. But with ancient history, we resist this logic. The resistance often comes from a specific place. Admitting connection would require explaining that connection. And the connection, in this case, would be difficult to explain through conventional frameworks. How did knowledge travel between Egypt and Peru if the Atlantic Ocean separated them? How did Cambodian architects develop identical astronomical principles as Egyptian priests centuries later? The patterns go deeper than astronomy and architecture. Across these cultures, we find similar symbolic representations. The serpent motif appears in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and India. The concept of a creator being or beings appears across cultures. The idea of visitors descending from the sky appears repeatedly. The notion of specific individuals serving as intermediaries between visitors and human populations emerges in multiple traditions. When patterns this consistent appear across disconnected populations, explanation becomes necessary. Either we accept that humans independently and repeatedly invented identical stories, developed identical architectural principles, and made identical astronomical observations, or we consider that they might have received similar information from a common source. The conventional response is that human psychology naturally leads to these patterns. Humans are drawn to serpent imagery. Humans naturally invent creator stories. Humans look at the sky and create myths about sky beings. All true statements. But they don't explain why the specificity of these patterns is so consistent. The human mind does create patterns, but it creates infinite patterns. There are thousands of possible architectural approaches. infinite symbolic systems, countless ways to conceptualize creation. Yet, across the world, we find surprising convergence in specific elements. The precision isn't just that similar ideas appeared, it's those similar specific ideas appeared. That specificity matters, because randomness produces variation. Consistency requires explanation. In 1994, archaeologists working in southern Turkey made a discovery that should have rewritten our understanding of human history. Instead, it was absorbed into academia with surprisingly little fanfare, discussed in specialized journals, but rarely mentioned in popular discourse. The site was called Göbekli Tepe, and what it revealed about human capability challenged fundamental assumptions about when civilization actually began. Conventional understanding places the development of organized civilization around 3000 BCE in Mesopotamia. Before that, we're told, humans were hunter-gatherers. They roamed in small groups. They had no permanent settlements. They certainly had no capacity for monumental construction. They were, in the framework of traditional history, primitive. Göbekli Tepe is dated to approximately 9500 BCE. That's over 6,000 years before civilization supposedly began. At this site, archaeologists found enormous T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing up to 16 tons. These weren't natural formations. They were deliberately quarried, transported, and erected in precise patterns. The level of organization required for such an undertaking is staggering. You need hundreds of people working in coordination. You need tools sophisticated enough to cut stone. You need engineering knowledge to move massive blocks. You need architectural planning to arrange them deliberately. The conventional response has been to redefine human capability rather than challenge the assumption that Göbekli Tepe proves. Archaeologists now acknowledge that humans at this time period were more sophisticated than previously believed. They had the capacity for organized labor. They had architectural knowledge. They could plan and execute complex projects. But this creates a new problem. If humans were capable of this level of organization and construction at 9500 BCE, why don't we find evidence of this capacity developing gradually? Where are the simpler structures? Where are the failed attempts? Where is the progression of learning that precedes mastery? Archaeological records typically show developmental sequences. We find early attempts, refinements, and eventual sophistication. With pottery, we can trace development from coarse attempts to refined techniques. With agriculture, we find evidence of gradual domestication of plants and animals. With architecture, we expect to find simple structures gradually becoming more complex. Göbekli Tepe appears almost fully formed. There's no obvious precedent, no simpler version from an earlier period, no documentation of how the knowledge to build such structures emerged. It simply appears in the archaeological record, sophisticated and organized. One interpretation is that Göbekli Tepe represents an anomaly, a unique achievement that didn't reflect broader capability. But the site itself tells a different story. The structure appears deliberate. The labor investment is enormous. The precision is remarkable. This wasn't a one-time experiment. This was a substantial project requiring significant knowledge and resources. What's more striking is the site's subsequent abandonment. Around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Massive amounts of earth and stone were used to cover the structures. It wasn't natural erosion. It was intentional concealment. The people who built it, or people who came after, chose to bury it and move on. This raises questions that conventional archaeology struggles to answer. Why would people invest such effort in creating a sophisticated structure, then deliberately bury it? What event or decision would lead to such an action? Why is there no continuous occupation at the site? One possibility, rarely discussed in academic circles, is that the knowledge to build Göbekli Tepe was transferred to human populations by external sources, then withdrawn. The structure represents a teaching tool or a monument to that contact. Once the knowledge had been transferred and the teaching was complete, there was no longer reason to maintain the site. It was buried, and the knowledge was dispersed among human populations, eventually spreading across the world in various forms. This isn't proven. It's speculative. But it accounts for the evidence in a way that conventional explanations struggle to do. It explains the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge. It explains why Göbekli Tepe appears almost fully formed without precedent. It explains why humans 6,000 years later would possess similar architectural and astronomical knowledge across disconnected continents. What Göbekli Tepe shows us is that our assumptions about human history are incomplete. Something happened those challenges our conventional understanding. Whether that something was independent human achievement or external knowledge transfer remains open to investigation, but the need for investigation itself cannot be denied. We treat ancient art as a window into how people lived. Archaeologists study pottery to understand daily life. They examine cave paintings to comprehend how ancient peoples interacted with their environment. They analyze sculptures to understand aesthetic values and religious beliefs. We accept art as documentary evidence. But we're inconsistent about what we allow that documentation to show us. When we see ancient artwork depicting animals, we accept it as evidence that those animals existed in that region. When we see depictions of hunting or farming, we treat it as documentation of those activities. We use art to understand technology, what tools looked like, how they were used, what materials were available. In all these contexts, we treat ancient artistic representation as fairly literal documentation of reality. But when ancient art depicts something anomalous, something that doesn't fit our understanding of what should have existed, we shift categories. We call it symbolic. We say it represents spiritual concepts rather than physical reality. We interpret it through metaphor rather than documentation. This is fundamentally inconsistent methodology. Either ancient art documents what people actually witnessed, or it doesn't. We can't accept it as documentary when it shows us what we expect to find, and dismiss it as symbolic when it shows us something unexpected. In southern Africa, the San people created rock paintings dating back over 2,000 years. Some of these paintings depict humanoid figures with what appear to be antennae or protrusions extending from their heads. The figures are rendered with careful detail and consistent repetition across multiple sites. Conventional interpretation is that these represent spiritual visions or shamanic experiences. But ask yourself, why would artists repeatedly and consistently depict the same anomalous feature if they weren't attempting to document something they actually perceived? In Mesoamerica, Mayan artwork shows figures seated in what appear to be control rooms of complex machinery. The depictions include intricate details, switches, displays, control panels rendered in stone. Conventional interpretation is that these represent mythological concepts or spiritual visions. But the level of technical detail is extraordinary. The depictions are precise and deliberate. In Egypt's Temple of Abydos, carved into stone with remarkable precision, are hieroglyphic images that appear to depict helicopters, submarines, and aircraft. When confronted with these carvings, Egyptologists explain them as coincidental overlays created when older carvings were refinished, with shadows and weathering creating the illusion of modern vehicles. But if this explanation is true, how many coincidences can we attribute before we acknowledge that coincidence itself becomes the less likely explanation? The consistent pattern across these sites is that ancient artists rendered unusual imagery with the same precision and care they applied to depicting familiar subjects. This precision suggests intentionality. The consistency across cultures suggests they weren't inventing random symbols, but documenting something genuinely observed or comprehended. Consider what would happen if ancient artists were actually attempting to document something extraordinary. How would they depict it? They would use the visual language available to them. They would draw what they saw as accurately as possible using their tools and materials. They would repeat the depiction if they witnessed or learned about similar events or beings. The artwork we find shows exactly this pattern. Careful, repeated, precise depictions of anomalous subjects. Not crude or fantastical renderings, but deliberate artistic documentation using whatever visual vocabulary the culture possessed. Modern skepticism assumes ancient peoples couldn't possibly have witnessed anything truly extraordinary. Therefore, any artwork depicting extraordinary things must be symbolic or spiritual. But this reasoning is circular. We start with the assumption that nothing extraordinary happened, then interpret all evidence through that assumption. What if we inverted the logic? What if ancient peoples were capable of witnessing and accurately documenting extraordinary events? What if their artwork represents their best attempts at recording and communicating what they saw? From that perspective, the consistency of these depictions across cultures becomes not coincidence, but documentation. Across cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, we find descriptions of the same phenomenon. Not identical descriptions. Each culture adapted the narrative to its own language and framework, but fundamentally similar in every crucial detail. These aren't isolated instances. They're a pattern so consistent that dismissing it requires increasing acts of faith in coincidence. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki descending in vehicles they called bu, sky platforms capable of vertical descent and ascent. The Mayan texts describe beings descending from the sky in vessels of light. The Sanskrit texts of India describe vimanas, flying vehicles with specific characteristics and capabilities. The Egyptian texts describe beings arriving in luminous crafts. The consistent element isn't that flying things existed. Many cultures could independently conceive of flight. The consistent element is that specific beings arrived in specific types of vessels with apparent purpose and intelligence. The descriptions of the visitors themselves show similar patterns. Across cultures, they're described as humanoid but distinctly different from humans, often taller, sometimes with unusual head proportions, frequently depicted with what appear to be technological attachments or equipment. In Mesoamerica, beings are consistently shown with elongated craniums. In Peru, similar artistic elements appear. In Mesopotamia, the beings are described in terms suggesting they required special equipment for survival. particularly for breathing, suggesting they might have needed technological assistance to survive Earth's atmosphere. The consistency extends to the activities attributed to these visitors. They're described as teaching humans specific knowledge: agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, construction techniques. They're described as establishing hierarchical relationships with human populations, with specific individuals identified as intermediaries or chosen representatives. They're described as having interests in mining operations and resource extraction. They're described as eventually withdrawing or departing, leaving humans to continue civilization independently. The statistical probability of these parallels emerging independently from unconnected populations is extraordinarily low, not impossible. We must acknowledge that human psychology naturally creates certain patterns, but improbable enough that alternative explanations deserve serious consideration. When archaeologists find similar pottery styles in different regions, they investigate whether trade routes or cultural contact could have spread that style. When they find similar agricultural techniques in separated populations, they consider whether knowledge transfer might have occurred. But when they find similar cosmological beliefs, similar descriptions of visitors, similar architectural principles, and similar astronomical knowledge across cultures that supposedly had no contact, they typically attribute it all to coincidence and universal human psychology. This inconsistency in methodology is telling. It suggests that we're filtering evidence through predetermined conclusions about what should have happened, rather than following evidence to wherever it leads. What if we applied rigorous methodology consistently? If we found these patterns appearing in 3 museums' collections with no documented connection, we would investigate potential shared origin. If we found identical mathematical formulas in 3 isolated mathematical traditions, we would ask whether they learned from the same source. Why, then, do we resist this logic when examining human history? The convergence of evidence from multiple independent domains, textual, artistic, architectural, astronomical, and archaeological, suggests something systematic rather than coincidental. Not proof of anything specific, but evidence that investigation is warranted. The pattern suggests that ancient peoples across the world received similar information from somewhere. Whether that somewhere was a shared external source or independent human discovery remains a genuine question. But the consistency of the patterns makes the question impossible to ignore without abandoning rigorous methodology. Some evidence doesn't require interpretation. It exists. It can be held and studied. It demonstrates capability that shouldn't exist according to conventional understanding of ancient technology. These artifacts represent the most straightforward challenge to orthodox history because they require no translation or contextual interpretation. They simply demand explanation. In a museum in Baghdad sits an artifact that shouldn't exist according to conventional knowledge of ancient Iraq. It's made of clay, copper, and iron. It's called the Baghdad Battery, and when archaeologists filled it with acidic juice, it generated electrical current. The basic construction is straightforward. A clay jar with a copper tube inside and an iron rod. When filled with electrolyte, it functioned as a voltaic cell, essentially a primitive battery. The immediate response from skeptics is that this was accidental discovery and ancient people stumbled upon the materials and created something that happened to work without understanding the principle. But the precision of construction suggests intentional design. The materials are specifically selected. The proportions are deliberate. The construction shows evidence of planning. The more uncomfortable question is, why would ancient peoples need to generate electrical current? What purpose would a battery serve in ancient Iraq? What were they powering? In Mesoamerica, crystal skulls have been discovered that display manufacturing techniques that cannot be replicated with modern tools without diamond cutting technology. The precision of the carving, the smoothness of the surfaces, the geometric accuracy all suggest manufacturing capability far exceeding what's documented for pre-Columbian cultures. At Nimrud in Iraq, ancient lenses have been discovered that demonstrate optical understanding. The precision of the grinding, the mathematical accuracy of the curvature, all suggest knowledge of optics that wasn't supposed to exist in that era. In Lebanon, the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek contains stones so massive, nearly 800 tons, that modern machinery cannot move them. Yet, they're positioned with precision, fitting together perfectly as part of a construction that required not just strength, but engineering knowledge to achieve. These objects exist. They can be studied. They demonstrate capability. The explanations offered for them ranged from reasonable to strained. Perhaps the Baghdad battery was accidental. Perhaps the crystal skulls were created with techniques we haven't rediscovered. Perhaps the precision of the Temple of Jupiter reflects human ingenuity we've underestimated. All these explanations are possible individually. But collectively, they paint a picture of ancient peoples possessing greater capability than conventional history suggests. And that picture becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when multiplied across numerous artifacts and sites. What makes these artifacts significant is that they represent tangible physical evidence. They don't depend on translation or interpretation. They simply exist, demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't exist. A modern observer can examine them and verify their characteristics. The conventional response is to explain each artifact individually while avoiding the larger pattern. The Baghdad battery is explained as accidental. The crystal skulls are explained through different mechanisms than the lenses are explained through. The Temple of Jupiter is explained through different methods than the precision structures of Peru are explained. But what happens when we step back and look at the accumulated evidence? What if we ask, what would we conclude if we found this evidence from a civilization we were studying scientifically, without the filter of our assumptions about what ancient peoples should have been capable of? We would conclude that the civilization possessed greater technological capability than previously documented. We would investigate what knowledge they possessed and how they acquired it. We would follow evidence rather than defend assumptions. The physical artifacts suggest that ancient people possessed knowledge and capability we've underestimated. Not necessarily extraterrestrial knowledge, but knowledge from somewhere, from someone, or perhaps knowledge that humans themselves possessed but have since forgotten. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands as perhaps the most compelling architectural mystery on Earth. Not because it's beautiful, though it is. Not because it's old, though it is. But because it represents a direct contradiction between what we're told is possible and what the physical evidence demonstrates actually happened. The basic facts are undisputed. The pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. The total weight is roughly 6 million tons. It covers an area of 13 acres. The sides align to true north with an error of only 0.05 degrees. The base is level to within inches across its entire span. The internal passages create geometric relationships that encode mathematical principles, including the value of pi. The astronomical alignments suggest knowledge of celestial mechanics that shouldn't exist. The conventional explanation is that ancient Egyptians built this monument over approximately 20 years, using copper tools, wooden sledges, and human labor. Ramps were constructed to move blocks up the sides. Hundreds or thousands of workers labored in coordinated effort. Through determination and organization, they assembled this massive structure. The explanation is internally consistent. We can imagine the process. We can see how it might have been accomplished. Modern experiments have demonstrated that workers using ancient tools can move large stone blocks. The explanation doesn't require anything impossible, just difficult. Monumental in scale, but not in the demands it places on human capability. So why does it feel inadequate? Begin with the precision. The alignment to true north is achieved without modern instruments, without telescopes, without the ability to measure stellar positions with the precision we possess. Yet the pyramid's alignment matches what we would achieve today using advanced surveying equipment. This isn't approximate. This is exact. How did ancient builders achieve this? The conventional response is that they observed the stars carefully and used mathematical geometry to determine true north. Possible, but it would require extraordinary dedication and precision in measurement. It would require multiple generations maintaining consistent records. It would require mathematical knowledge to translate stellar observations into directional accuracy. More puzzling is the internal geometry. The passages and chambers don't serve obvious functional purposes. They don't store anything important. They don't improve the structural integrity. They don't serve religious or ceremonial functions that require that specific arrangement. Yet they're built with precision, equal to or exceeding the exterior. Why invest such effort in internal structures that serve no documented purpose? These passages encode mathematical relationships, including pi calculated to multiple decimal places. How did ancient builders know the value of pi to that precision? Mathematics didn't discover pi to that accuracy until millennia later. Yet it's encoded in the pyramid's geometry. The astronomical alignments are more disturbing. The pyramid appears to encode knowledge of precession, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete. The ancient Egyptians shouldn't have known about precession. They couldn't have observed it in real time. Yet structures built around the pyramid appear deliberately oriented to mark precessional cycles. Why would they track something that takes thousands of years to complete unless they already knew why it mattered? The conventional response to these anomalies is that they're coincidental. That the builders, through careful observation and mathematical genius, happened to arrive at these precise measurements and relationships. That the astronomical alignments, while remarkable, emerged from careful observation rather than pre-existing knowledge. This explanation is possible. Humans are capable of remarkable achievements through dedication and ingenuity. But it requires accepting that every anomaly we find is coincidental. That precision in alignment is lucky timing. That knowledge of pi centuries before it was discovered emerged independently. That astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist was somehow independently developed. At what point does coincidence become so frequent that we recognize it as evidence of something else? The pyramid stands as physical proof that something about the conventional narrative is incomplete. Whether that something involves external knowledge, forgotten human capability, or extraordinary human achievement. The monument itself suggests that our understanding of ancient Egypt is inadequate. Across ancient civilizations, specific individuals are credited with architectural and technological breakthroughs. But these individuals share a curious characteristic. Their origins are mysterious. Their training is undocumented. Their knowledge appears suddenly, without precedent or explanation. In Egypt, Imhotep is credited with designing the step pyramid at Saqqara. According to historical records, he appeared in the reign of Pharaoh Djoser, already possessing complete architectural knowledge. No evidence of how he developed this knowledge. No record of mentors or learning periods. No documentation of gradual skill development. He simply appears in the historical record as a fully formed architect and engineer. After his death, he was deified, recognition of his extraordinary status and knowledge. In Mesopotamia, the texts describe Enki as a being who possessed knowledge of all crafts and sciences. Rather than being portrayed as someone who developed this knowledge through study or experience, he's described as an inherent possessor of all technical knowledge. He appears in the text as a source from which humans learn, not as someone who learned himself. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl is described as a feathered serpent who descended from the sky and taught human civilization. The legends describe him arriving with knowledge of agriculture, construction, mathematics, and governance. He didn't emerge from the local population. He arrived from elsewhere, bringing knowledge with him. In Peru, similar patterns emerge with Viracocha, described as arriving from the sea and teaching human populations how to build, farm, and organize society. Again, not portrayed as a local individual who developed through learning, but as an external being bringing preformed knowledge. In Hindu texts, celestial beings called the Shining Ones are described as descending from the sky and teaching humans knowledge of engineering and mathematics. The texts don't describe these beings as human. They're portrayed as visitors bringing knowledge from elsewhere. In Greece, Hephaestus is depicted as possessing technological knowledge of impossible sophistication. He creates objects of extraordinary craftsmanship. But unlike other Greek gods and heroes, who are portrayed as developing their abilities through experience, Hephaestus is depicted as inherently possessing his technological skill. The pattern is consistent across cultures. Architectural and technological knowledge is consistently attributed to figures who either arrived from elsewhere or possessed knowledge that couldn't be explained through normal human development. These aren't portrayed as particularly clever humans who figured things out through experimentation. They're portrayed as external sources of knowledge, whether described as divine beings, celestial visitors, or learned teachers from elsewhere. One explanation is that all these cultures independently invented similar mythology, explaining their technological knowledge. That humans naturally attribute their own achievements to external sources, to gods or divine beings. This is psychologically plausible. Humans do attribute achievements beyond their normal expectation to extraordinary sources. But there's a pattern within the pattern. The specific characteristics attributed to these knowledge bearers are consistent. They arrive from elsewhere. They possess complete knowledge rather than developing it gradually. They teach specific skills, not abstract philosophy, but practical technical knowledge. They eventually depart or are no longer active. If these were purely symbolic representations of human achievement or natural phenomena, we would expect greater variation in how different cultures conceptualize them. Instead, We find remarkable consistency in the specific details. Consider an alternative possibility. What if these legendary figures were based on actual individuals or beings who transferred knowledge to human populations? What if the legends represent humanity's attempt to preserve memory of genuine contact and knowledge transfer? The inconsistencies would reflect cultural adaptation of shared memory. The consistencies would reflect the actual events those memories preserve. This is speculative, but it accounts for the evidence in a way that pure mythology doesn't quite do. It explains why the same figure appears in different cultures. Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Viracocha in Peru, Thoth in Egypt, with fundamentally similar characteristics and similar functions. The legend suggests something happened that ancient peoples considered important enough to preserve and pass down through generations. What that something was remains open to investigation. Something changed in human history. At some point, the technological progression shifted. The precision visible in the oldest monuments gradually diminished in later constructions. The knowledge that appeared fully formed in ancient times seemed to gradually fade as generations passed. The pattern suggests not gradual improvement, but rather gradual loss, remembering rather than inventing, decline rather than development. In Egypt, this pattern is visible in the architectural record. The Great Pyramid represents the apex of precision. Subsequent pyramids, built later, show decline in construction quality, mathematical precision, and engineering sophistication. The Bent Pyramid, built slightly later, shows structural problems and engineering issues not present in earlier constructions. Later pyramids demonstrate continued decline. This isn't the pattern we'd expect from gradual improvement through experience and refinement. It's the opposite. The same pattern appears in other cultures. In Mesopotamia, the precision and sophistication of the oldest ziggurats exceeds later constructions. In Peru, the stonework at Pumapunku and other early sites shows precision that later Incan construction, while impressive, doesn't quite match. In India, the most sophisticated temple construction appears in the oldest sites rather than evolving over centuries. Conventional history struggles to explain this pattern. The standard assumption is that human knowledge and capability increase over time. We progress. We learn from past mistakes. We build on the achievements of previous generations. Technology improves, precision increases. Everything should get better. Yet the evidence often shows the opposite. The oldest structures are the most precisely engineered. The oldest knowledge appears most sophisticated. What follows is refinement of existing knowledge rather than expansion into new areas. Eventually, knowledge is lost entirely. And later, civilizations must rediscover what earlier people possessed. One explanation is that knowledge was being deliberately transmitted to human civilizations. Then the source of that transmission withdrew. If a civilization is receiving external knowledge and guidance, they achieve capabilities that seem extraordinary compared to their documented independent development. The knowledge appears fully formed because it was transferred, not discovered through trial and error. What happens when that external knowledge source is no longer available? The civilization must preserve and pass down what it learned. Some knowledge is preserved accurately through written records and careful instruction. Some knowledge is lost through misunderstanding or incomplete documentation. Some is transformed through cultural reinterpretation until it becomes unrecognizable from the original. Over generations, without the external source to correct misunderstandings or fill gaps. Knowledge degrades. Techniques are forgotten. Mathematical principles are lost. Precision declines. What was once routine becomes impossible. Monuments built with ease by previous generations become legendary achievements attributed to giants or gods. This pattern appears throughout history. The legends of giants building monuments before the current human age. The stories of gods who possessed knowledge humans no longer possessed. The myths of a golden age followed by decline. These appear in cultures across the world, in different forms with different details, but the same basic narrative structure. A time when knowledge was greater, then decline, then loss. In Hindu texts, the concept of yugas, ages of decreasing knowledge and capability, reflects this pattern. In Mesoamerican calendars, the cycles of world ages include periods of greater knowledge followed by decline. In Mesopotamian texts, similar patterns of decline from a golden age appear. In Greek mythology, the ages of a man progress from gold to silver to bronze to iron, each worse than the previous. The consistency of this narrative structure across cultures is striking. Not identical narratives, but fundamental similarity in structure. Ages of greater capability, followed by decline. Knowledge being lost. The need to preserve what was learned before it's completely forgotten. What if these weren't purely mythological concepts, but cultural memory of genuine events? What if human civilizations did receive knowledge and guidance, achieved remarkable things, and then faced the withdrawal of that support? The cultural response would be to preserve what was learned and pass it down to future generations. This would explain why the oldest monuments represent the apex of precision, why knowledge appears fully formed rather than gradually developing, why later generations struggled to maintain what previous generations possessed, why they created legends of gods and giants and golden ages, preserving in mythological form the memory of when knowledge and capability were greater. The evidence suggests something changed in human history. Knowledge became limited. Capability declined. What was routine became legendary. The monuments that stood as proof of human achievement were gradually understood less and less, until future generations could only speculate about how they were built. Whether that change represents the withdrawal of external knowledge or simply the loss of institutional knowledge through cultural disruption remains an open question. But the pattern itself, greatest achievement earliest, followed by decline, is undeniable in the archaeological record. Across the world, structures stand that serve no obvious purpose. They required enormous effort to create. They demonstrate precision and organization beyond what we'd expect from their stated functions. They exist as monuments to mystery, physical proof that something doesn't align with conventional explanations. The Nazca Lines stretch across the Peruvian plateau in patterns so vast that they're best viewed from the air. Geometric shapes, animal figures, lines extending for hundreds of meters. The precision is remarkable. The effort required is staggering. Thousands of hours of labor moving stones and earth to create patterns that, from ground level, are largely meaningless. To someone standing on the plateau, the Nazca Lines are simply arranged stones. Only from altitude does their true shape become apparent. This raises an immediate question. Why create patterns meant to be viewed from the air in a region with no documented history of flight? The conventional explanation is that they serve religious or ceremonial purposes. that they held spiritual meaning to the civilization that created them. Possible. But it doesn't fully explain why people would invest such tremendous effort creating patterns whose full form they couldn't appreciate. Stonehenge in England stands as a monument to precision and organization. Massive stones, transported from great distances, arranged in perfect geometric patterns, aligned to astronomical events. The effort required to move these stones without modern machinery is extraordinary. The purpose remains debated. The most accepted theory is that it served religious and astronomical purposes. But the precision of the construction and the effort invested seem disproportionate to those functions. Easter Island's Moai statues present a different mystery. Massive carved heads transported across an island without wheeled vehicles or documented advanced machinery. Positioned with precision, facing inland rather than toward the sea. The effort is extraordinary. The purpose is unclear. The conventional explanation is that they held spiritual significance to the island's inhabitants. But the resources invested in creating and positioning these statues suggest purposes beyond what we've documented. The underwater structure known as Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan displays regular geometric patterns and mathematical proportions. Debate continues about whether it's natural formation or artificial construction. But the regularity of its patterns and the mathematical relationships within its structure suggest intentional design. If artificial, it represents construction capability in ancient Japan that isn't documented in historical records. Aligned structures appear across the globe. The Serpent Mound in Ohio, which like the Nazca Lines is best appreciated from the air. Grid patterns found at various archaeological sites showing deliberate organization and planning. The consistent use of geometric precision and astronomical alignment across these diverse locations suggests something systematic rather than random. The conventional response is to explain each structure individually through local religious or ceremonial purposes. But when similar structures appear across the globe, structures that require enormous effort, that demonstrate precision beyond their stated function, that in many cases are best appreciated from perspectives the builders shouldn't have possessed. The pattern itself demands explanation. One possibility is that these structures served purposes we haven't identified. That they functioned as landing markers or navigation aids. That they communicated information to beings approaching from above. This is speculative, but it accounts for certain characteristics of these monuments that conventional explanations struggle with. Another possibility is that these structures represented the height of human achievement during specific periods, demonstrating capability that later cultures lost or forgot. They represent peaks of knowledge and organization that subsequent generations viewed as legendary achievements of gods or giants. What's undeniable is that these monuments represent enormous expenditure of resources and effort. Resources and effort are typically invested in things that matter to the civilization making the investment. The fact that these structures require such investment suggests purposes we haven't fully understood. The monuments stand as physical evidence that something in our understanding of ancient civilizations is incomplete. Whether that incompleteness reflects forgotten purposes, lost technological knowledge, or contact with external sources remains a question worth investigating. If you stand at Stonehenge on the summer solstice, the sun rises directly over the heelstone. This isn't accidental. The structure was deliberately built to create this astronomical alignment. The precision required to achieve this alignment is significant. The effort invested in arranging massive stones to mark a specific celestial event seems disproportionate to the practical benefit. Yet across the world, similar patterns of astronomical precision appear. The Great Pyramid aligns to true north with extraordinary accuracy. Angkor Wat marks specific astronomical events through its architectural orientation. Mayan structures incorporate astronomical knowledge with precision that suggests deliberate calculation. Temples in Peru display alignments that track celestial movements. The precision itself isn't what's puzzling. Humans are capable of precise observation. If motivated, we can track celestial events carefully and use that knowledge to guide construction. The puzzle is the consistency of this pattern across disconnected cultures and the investment in tracking phenomena that don't directly impact practical survival. Why would ancient peoples invest such effort in marking astronomical events? Some clear purposes exist. Solstices and equinoxes mark seasons relevant to agriculture. Tracking the moon aids in timekeeping. But some astronomical phenomena that these structures track serve no obvious practical function. The precession of the equinoxes, for instance, is an extremely slow phenomenon. One complete cycle takes approximately 26,000 years. Observable change within a human lifetime would be imperceptible. Yet structures appear deliberately built to mark precessional cycles. Why would people track something so slow that they themselves would never observe measurable change? One answer is that they were preserving knowledge for future generations, that they understood precession existed and built monuments to mark it for posterity. But this requires assuming ancient peoples understood a phenomenon that wouldn't be scientifically discovered for thousands of years. Another answer is that they were instructed to track it. That external sources provided this knowledge and the instruction to maintain records of it across generations. From this perspective, the monuments serve as celestial markers, physical records of astronomical knowledge maintained for purposes we haven't fully understood. The consistent appearance of astronomical alignments across cultures suggests either independent discovery of the same phenomena or knowledge transfer from a common source. When we find the same astronomical precision appearing in Egypt, Peru, Cambodia, and across other regions separated by vast distances and centuries of time, coincidence becomes statistically unlikely. What becomes visible is that ancient peoples possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and were deliberately preserving that knowledge through monuments designed to mark celestial events. This knowledge apparently was important enough to justify enormous resource investment, important enough to pass down across generations, important enough to embed in the very structures of their civilizations. The monuments themselves became celestial calculators, structures that could be read to determine astronomical positions and predict celestial events, libraries of information written in stone rather than on tablets, knowledge that would survive millennia even if written records were lost. This suggests a level of intentionality and long-term planning that challenges our assumptions about ancient peoples. They weren't simply marking important seasonal events. They were maintaining precise astronomical records across centuries. They were building monuments specifically designed to transmit this knowledge to future generations. From this perspective, the astronomical alignments aren't incidental features of structures built for other purposes. They're central to the structure's function. The monuments exist to mark and preserve astronomical knowledge. The religious or ceremonial purposes may have been secondary to the primary function of celestial tracking and knowledge preservation. This interpretation accounts for the precision we observe. It explains why such effort was invested in marking astronomical events. It provides purpose for structures whose functions have puzzled historians. And it suggests that ancient peoples understood something about the celestial mechanics they were tracking. Knowledge whose source and purpose remain subjects for investigation. Consider a simple question. If you wanted to leave a message for someone approaching from the sky, how would you do it? You couldn't send radio signals if you lacked the technology. You couldn't launch spacecraft to meet them. But you could create something visible from above, something that would announce your presence and location, something that demonstrated your capability and understanding. This possibility changes how we interpret certain monuments. The Nazca Lines, best viewed from the air, become markers announcing the location of a civilization. Landing zones, perhaps, or signals of readiness. The geometric patterns demonstrate mathematical understanding. The effort invested demonstrates organizational capability. From above, these patterns would be immediately visible and interpretable. The alignments at Stonehenge and similar sites, when viewed from above, create patterns that communicate information. The precision itself becomes a message. We understand mathematics. We possess technological capability. We can organize resources at scale. The message isn't written in words. It's written in stone. It's written in precision and effort and careful planning. This interpretation remains speculative, but it accounts for certain characteristics of these monuments that conventional explanations struggle with. Why would people create patterns best viewed from altitudes they couldn't reach? Why would they invest such effort in astronomical alignments beyond what practical purposes required? Why would they preserve such specific knowledge across generations? One answer is that they were communicating with beings who could approach from above, with visitors whose presence or return they anticipated. The monuments themselves become a form of communication, a signal that could be read from the sky. This interpretation finds support in certain ancient texts. Descriptions of specific locations as meeting places or places of ascension. References to monuments built specifically as gathering points or communication nodes. In some traditions, specific mountains or structures are described as contact points where celestial beings could be reached. What emerges is a possibility that certain ancient civilizations might have been deliberately maintaining these monuments, not just as religious or ceremonial spaces, but as active communication mechanisms. Signals to the sky, announcements of presence and readiness. Demonstrations of capability and understanding. The monuments might have served dual purposes. For the local population, they held religious and ceremonial significance. They marked important astronomical events. They organized social structures and values. But simultaneously, they served as visible markers and communication signals for beings who could observe from above. This would explain the precision. It would explain the astronomical knowledge. It would explain the enormous resource investment. It would explain why certain locations were chosen. They were visible from the air and strategically positioned. It would explain why these structures were maintained across generations, despite their unclear religious or practical purpose. From this perspective, Human civilizations weren't building these monuments purely for themselves. They were building them as part of an interaction with something beyond themselves. The monuments represented a form of dialogue, a civilization announcing its presence and readiness, a signal that could be read from the sky. Whether this interpretation is correct remains unknowable without definitive evidence, but it provides a framework that accounts for the peculiar characteristics of these monuments. It explains their precision, their astronomical knowledge, their enormous resource investment, and their persistent maintenance across centuries despite changing cultures and beliefs. The monuments stand as physical evidence of communication. Not necessarily communication that succeeded, but the attempt to communicate, the desire to reach towards something beyond the immediate horizon, the effort to leave a message that could persist across time and reach eyes that might observe from the sky. Throughout history, across multiple cultures and time periods, people have documented observations from the sky. Not all of these observations can be easily dismissed as misidentification of natural phenomena. Some come from credible sources trained in observation. Some involve multiple witnesses corroborating the same event. Some were recorded in official documents by governments and military organizations. Collectively, they represent a phenomenon worth investigating rather than dismissing. In ancient Egypt, during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III, scribes documented an extraordinary event. According to the official record, multiple objects appeared in the sky in formation. The accounts describe them as bright, silent, and moving with apparent intelligence. They changed direction without gradual turning. They appeared and disappeared. The scribes recorded these observations not as spiritual visions, but as actual events, as occurrences significant enough to document in official historical records. These weren't isolated accounts. Similar observations appear in Egyptian records across multiple reigns. Similar phenomena are documented in Babylonian astronomy texts. The Sumerians maintained detailed records of sky observations. These weren't casual mentions, but deliberate documentation by people trained in observation and record keeping. In China, historical records spanning centuries document observations of unusual phenomena in the sky. Objects described as bright lights moving with apparent purpose. Formations of objects moving in coordination. Descents and ascents. The records treat this as historical fact, not as myths or spiritual experiences. They're recorded alongside other historical events as part of the official record. In India, Sanskrit texts describe vimanas, aerial vehicles appearing in the sky with specific characteristics. The descriptions include details about movement, appearance, and behavior. They're described not as mythological imaginings, but as observations worth recording and preserving. In Rome during the time of Julius Caesar, objects were observed in the sky and documented by military observers. In Europe throughout the medieval period, monks and scholars recorded observations of unusual phenomena. In Central and South America, similar records appear in indigenous chronicles. What becomes apparent when examining these accounts is that they share common characteristics. The objects display intelligence in their movements. They appear to multiple witnesses simultaneously. They're treated as important enough to document officially. They're consistent in basic description, even though specific details vary by culture and time period. Modern skepticism explains these accounts through misidentification, comets, meteors, unusual atmospheric phenomena, or psychological delusions affecting multiple witnesses simultaneously. Individually, each account can be explained through conventional means. But the accumulation of accounts across centuries, across cultures, with similar basic characteristics, creates a different kind of evidence. Consider how we treat historical documentation in other contexts. Says, when multiple sources describe a historical event, we treat that convergence as evidence that something occurred. When eyewitness accounts are consistent across independent observers, we consider that convergence significant. Yet with these sky phenomena, we're more dismissive. We require evidence from more reliable sources before accepting that something genuinely occurred. The inconsistency in how we treat evidence based on content rather than source is significant. We accept ancient texts as reliable historical documentation when describing familiar events. But when those texts describe unusual phenomena, we become skeptical. This isn't rigorous methodology. It's filtered reasoning based on preconceptions about what should be possible. What if we applied consistent standards? What if we treated these accounts as historical documentation of events that ancient peoples witnessed, regardless of how unusual those events might be? The accounts would then represent evidence that something was happening in the sky, that multiple civilizations considered significant enough to document and preserve. The consistency of these accounts across time and culture becomes remarkable. Not identical, each culture describes phenomena through its own framework, but fundamentally similar. Observers witnessing something extraordinary, observers responding by documenting and preserving the accounts. Observers treating the events as historically significant rather than purely mythological. From this perspective, these ancient accounts aren't evidence that aliens visited Earth, but they are evidence that ancient peoples witnessed sky phenomena they considered important. What those phenomena actually were remains a genuine question. But the convergence of accounts across cultures suggests something genuine was observed. Something worth investigating rather than dismissing. When we read ancient accounts of sky phenomena, we must translate not just language, but cultural framework. The Sumerians didn't have vocabulary for spacecraft or aircraft. They described what they saw using the language available to them. When they described something descending from the sky that moved with apparent will and intelligence, they used metaphors available in their culture. They called it a chariot, a ship, a divine vessel. Understanding ancient descriptions requires recognizing what linguists call category error. When we describe something from an unknown category, using language from known categories. If you'd never seen an elephant and someone described one, you might imagine a giant pig or a hairy cow. You'd use categories you understood to conceptualize something novel. Ancient observers faced similar challenges. If they witnessed something that didn't fit their existing categories, something that wasn't a chariot or a bird or a natural phenomenon, they would necessarily describe it using the closest available metaphors. The Sumerians called Anunnaki vehicles mu, sky platforms. They described them as bright, moving with purpose, capable of vertical movement. When translated into modern language, these descriptions sound like attempts to describe aircraft or spacecraft. The Egyptians described beings arriving in luminous vessels. The description parallels modern accounts of unidentified aerial phenomena. Bright, capable of unusual movement, demonstrating apparent intelligence. The Mayans described similar vehicles arriving from the sky. The Sanskrit texts describe vimanas with specific characteristics: vertical takeoff capability, extreme speed, the ability to remain stationary in the air. When we extract the core elements from these descriptions, stripped of cultural metaphor, we find consistency. Objects that move through the sky. Objects that defy expectations about how things move. Objects that demonstrate apparent control and intelligence. Objects described by multiple cultures across separated time periods. The consistency is what makes these descriptions significant. If one culture described sky phenomena through metaphor, we might attribute it to imagination. If multiple cultures independently described similar phenomena using their own cultural metaphors, the convergence suggests they were describing something real. More striking is the specificity. The descriptions include details that would be unnecessary if they were pure invention. The Sumerian descriptions of Anunnaki requiring breathing assistance suggest witnesses observing beings in environmental suits. The Egyptian descriptions of specific movements and behaviors suggest observation of actions that seemed purposeful and intentional. The Sanskrit descriptions of mechanical specifics suggest observers trying to document technical details they didn't fully understand. This is how descriptions of unknown phenomena typically work. When trained observers witness something genuinely anomalous, they attempt to describe details that might help others understand what was observed. The details often seem odd because they're describing something outside normal experience. But the specificity of detail indicates genuine observation rather than pure imagination. Consider how modern military pilots describe unidentified aerial phenomena they've witnessed. They provide specific details about movement, speed, apparent mass, and behavior. They describe things that contradict known physics. They provide technical details because they're attempting to communicate what they actually observed, even though the phenomena contradict their expectations. Ancient observers likely did the same. They witnessed something. They attempted to describe it accurately using available language. The descriptions include specific details that would be unnecessary in pure mythology, but natural in genuine observation reports. The linguistic analysis of these descriptions supports the interpretation that ancient peoples were documenting what they observed rather than inventing pure mythology. The specificity, the consistency across cultures, and the details that seem to describe technology suggest attempts at accurate documentation. From this perspective, ancient texts become not mythology to dismiss, but historical documentation to study carefully. Documentation of events that people considered important enough to preserve and pass down through generations. Documentation that suggests something was happening. Something that multiple observers across multiple cultures felt compelled to record and remember. What that something was remains a genuine question. But the descriptions themselves suggest ancient peoples witnessed something they found significant, remarkable, and worth preserving in permanent record. Across the world, humanity's holiest sites share characteristics that seem more than coincidental. They're positioned at locations of geographic significance. They're placed at high altitudes where they're visible from great distances. They're aligned to specific celestial events. They're the locations where ancient peoples reported extraordinary phenomena. They're where the most impressive architectural monuments were built. Mount Kailash in Tibet is considered sacred by Hindus, Buddhists, and practitioners of Bon. It's positioned at the geographic center of Asia. It sits at high altitude. It has specific astronomical significance. The positioning isn't random. The location appears deliberately chosen. Machu Picchu in Peru sits at high altitude in the Andes Mountains. It's positioned in a location visible for great distances. It contains structures with astronomical alignments. The architecture demonstrates the most sophisticated construction techniques of any Incan site. The location seems deliberately chosen for visibility and accessibility from the air. Angkor Wat in Cambodia is aligned to specific celestial events. It's positioned as a massive temple complex, visible from great distances. It incorporates astronomical knowledge in its design. The location seems strategically chosen. Jerusalem holds sacred significance in 3 world religions. It's positioned in a location of geographic and strategic importance. Throughout history, it's been the site of extraordinary phenomena, according to religious and historical accounts. Multiple religious traditions describe celestial events occurring at this location. When we examine these sacred sites globally, patterns emerge. They're not randomly distributed. They cluster at locations that will be visible from the air and strategically accessible. They possess astronomical significance. They are often the sites where ancient peoples reported extraordinary phenomena. The conventional explanation is that humans chose these locations for spiritual or defensive purposes. Humans naturally gravitate toward high places. High altitudes offer visibility and protection. Mountains inspire spiritual reverence. All true statements. But they don't fully explain why the most sacred sites across different religions share such consistent characteristics. One possibility is that certain locations held special significance specifically because they were contact points. If visitors from advanced civilizations arrived on Earth, they would likely choose locations that were accessible, visible, and strategically important. High-altitude sites would be visible from the air. Geographic centers would be easily located. Locations with specific astronomical significance might have been deliberately marked for navigation purposes. If these locations served as contact points, they would naturally acquire spiritual significance to local populations. The extraordinary nature of the contact would inspire religious reverence. The sites would become pilgrimage destinations. The locations would be marked with the most impressive monuments the civilization could create as offerings or expressions of reverence. This would explain why human history's most sacred sites share characteristics that seem more systematic than purely coincidental. They would have been deliberately chosen as meeting places. The spiritual significance would have emerged from genuine contact, rather than purely from human psychology. The concentrated effort to build impressive monuments at these sites would reflect the significance the locations held. If regular contact occurred at these sites, they would be worth the enormous resource investment required to build structures like Angkor Wat, Machu Picchu, or the Temple Mount. The astronomical alignments would serve practical purposes, marking locations that could be found from the sky. The high altitudes would facilitate observation and approach from above. The geographic positioning would make the sites easily identifiable. From this perspective, sacred sites represent not just human spiritual creativity, but actual locations of significance in a larger historical narrative. Locations where humans encountered something beyond themselves. Locations preserved as sacred precisely because something extraordinary occurred there. The sites stand as monuments to contact. Whether that contact was genuine, and if so, what form it took, remains open to investigation. But the consistent characteristics of these globally distributed sacred sites suggest something more than coincidence. Something systematic. something worth examining carefully, rather than dismissing as purely human spiritual invention. In ancient Egypt, society was organized in a remarkably clear hierarchy. The pharaoh sat at the apex. Below him was the priesthood, individuals with special access to knowledge and divine communication. Below that were administrators, craftspeople, and laborers. The system was rigid, formalized, and maintained across centuries of Egyptian civilization. What's remarkable about this structure isn't that it existed. Hierarchical organizations are common among human societies, but that it appeared almost fully formed without documented evolutionary process. We don't find records of simpler governance structures gradually becoming more complex. We find the hierarchical system already sophisticated at Egypt's earliest historical moments. In Mesopotamia, similar patterns emerge. The Sumerian city-states possessed clear hierarchical structures, with kings identified as intermediaries between the gods and humans, not as representatives chosen by humans, but as specific individuals chosen by divine entities for that role. The governance structures appeared organized and systematic from the earliest historical records. The priesthood served a specific function in these hierarchical systems. Their role wasn't merely religious, they served as keepers of knowledge. In Egypt, priests maintained astronomical records. They preserved mathematical and engineering knowledge. They served as custodians of information deemed important enough to preserve across generations. What becomes apparent is that these hierarchical systems seem designed for a specific purpose, maintaining and transmitting knowledge. The priesthood's role wasn't primarily to conduct religious rituals, though they did that too. Their primary function appears to have been knowledge preservation and controlled transmission. This structure makes sense if knowledge was being transferred to human populations by external sources. An external intelligence would need organized contact points. They would need individuals specifically designated to receive knowledge and be responsible for preserving and transmitting it. They would need hierarchical structures that could maintain the knowledge across generations even without continued direct contact. The consistency of these hierarchical patterns across unconnected civilizations is striking. Different cultures organized their priesthoods differently, but the fundamental role remained constant. Individual humans designated as intermediaries between celestial or divine entities and human populations. Individuals responsible for knowledge preservation and transmission. Consider what this structure accomplishes. It creates a formal mechanism for knowledge transfer and preservation. It identifies specific individuals as responsible for particular knowledge. It creates institutional memory that could survive individual deaths or changes in leadership. It provides a framework within which external knowledge could be transmitted to human populations. In Egypt, the priesthood maintained knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. In Mesopotamia, similar roles were performed. In Mesoamerica, the priestly class kept calendrical and astronomical knowledge. In India, Brahmin priests preserved Vedic knowledge. Across cultures, priests served as knowledge custodians. The knowledge preserved was remarkably consistent across cultures. Astronomical information, mathematical principles, engineering techniques, practical knowledge about agriculture and governance, knowledge that would be valuable for developing civilization. If this knowledge was independently discovered by each culture, we would expect it to vary. Different cultures would develop different mathematical systems, different astronomical interpretations, different engineering approaches. Instead, we find fundamental similarities. The hierarchical structures, combined with the similar knowledge they preserved, suggest organization around knowledge transmission. Structures designed to receive, preserve, and pass down information. Structures that maintained consistency across generations and across cultures. The priesthood's role as intermediaries between celestial entities and human populations is particularly telling. These weren't described as individuals who communed with abstract spiritual forces. They were described as individuals specifically chosen by celestial beings to receive knowledge and maintain relationships. From this perspective, the hierarchical structures weren't simply human political organization. They were designed frameworks for knowledge transfer and institutional memory. Structures that made sense if external knowledge was being transferred and needed to be preserved and transmitted across generations by designated human intermediaries. The Library of Alexandria has been mythologized as a repository of human knowledge. But examining what actually survived from that library reveals something more specific. The collection focused heavily on practical knowledge, mathematics, engineering, astronomy, and medicine. While philosophical and literary works were certainly present, the core of the collection was technical knowledge. The texts preserved in these libraries documented specific information, mathematical principles, astronomical observations, engineering techniques, medical procedures. The collection was systematic, suggesting deliberate curation around knowledge deemed important to preserve. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the 20th century, contained texts carefully preserved in hidden locations. Religious texts, certainly, but also texts focusing on specific knowledge, astronomical information, calendrical systems, mathematical principles. The effort to preserve these texts in protected locations suggests the content was considered important enough to justify extraordinary preservation measures. Throughout ancient civilizations, we find similar patterns: texts carefully preserved, knowledge systematically documented, information maintained across generations with what appears to be deliberate intention. The Vedic texts of India were preserved through oral tradition with such precision that Sanskrit scholars recognize mathematical encoding in the language structure itself. Why would poets encoding historical knowledge also deliberately structure the language mathematically unless the knowledge being encoded was mathematical? The Emerald Tablets, whether historically accurate or legendary in form, supposedly preserve teachings from advanced beings. Other texts claim to record knowledge transmitted from celestial visitors. These might be historically inaccurate accounts, but they reflect a pattern. Civilizations preserving texts they believed contained transmitted knowledge. What becomes visible is that certain texts were treated differently from other texts. These weren't casual stories or entertainment. They were preserved with care, protected, transmitted to new generations with precision. The effort invested in preservation suggests the knowledge was considered essential. More significantly, many of these texts contain knowledge that appears impractical for the immediate context. The Vedas preserve detailed astronomical information in poetry, specifically structured for memorization. Why preserve such detailed astronomical knowledge in such specific form unless accuracy in transmission mattered greatly? Why encode mathematical principles in poetic language unless the specific mathematical content was the goal? The texts often emphasize the importance of precise transmission. Don't alter the knowledge. Pass it down exactly as received. Preserve it for future generations. This emphasis on precision is distinctive. Typical mythology allows for variation and adaptation. But these texts demand exactness. Consider what this pattern suggests. If external knowledge was being transferred to human populations, how would that knowledge be preserved? Written records would be important. Multiple copies would ensure survival if some were lost. Oral traditions would supplement written records. Priestly custodians would be responsible for maintenance and transmission. Emphasis would be placed on precise transmission to prevent degradation of the knowledge over time. This is exactly what we find in the historical record. Multiple copies of important texts. Oral traditions paralleling written records. Designated custodians responsible for preservation. Explicit emphasis on precise transmission. The entire system appears designed to preserve knowledge across generations, despite cultural change or institutional disruption. The knowledge preserved, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, would be valuable for developing civilization. The systematic preservation suggests importance beyond cultural or spiritual significance. These weren't preserved primarily for religious inspiration or philosophical contemplation. They were preserved because the knowledge itself mattered. The keeper texts function as libraries of transferred knowledge, documents that preserve information important enough to justify extraordinary preservation efforts. Documents that show evidence of deliberate encoding to ensure accurate transmission. Documents that preserve knowledge appearing disproportionate to the immediate practical needs of the cultures that preserved them. From this perspective, these texts become not just historical documents, but evidence of knowledge transfer, records of information that important enough to preserve across centuries, evidence that something, knowledge, instruction, guidance, was being maintained through institutional mechanisms designed specifically for that purpose. Across the world's religions and spiritual traditions, a consistent pattern emerges. Prophecies or expectations of a return. Not a generic return of divine beings in some abstract future, but specific prophecies tied to particular circumstances or timeframes. These aren't isolated to one tradition. They appear in Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and indigenous spiritual systems. In Hinduism, the concept of yugas describes cycles of ages. Each age has specific characteristics. The current age is the Kali Yuga, an age of decline and difficulty. But Hindu texts describe a future avatar, Kalki, who will arrive to restore balance and begin a new age. The prophecy is specific. The conditions are described. The expected outcome is detailed. In Buddhism, the concept of Maitreya, a future Buddha who will arrive in a distant future to teach again and restore Dharma, appears across Buddhist traditions. The expectation is maintained. Specific conditions are described for when this arrival will occur. In Christianity, the second coming represents an expectation that Jesus Christ will return to earth. The event is described in specific terms. Conditions are specified. The outcome is detailed. It's treated not as metaphorical spiritual transformation, but as literal return. In Islam, similar concepts exist. The Mahdi in Islamic theology is expected to arrive before the end times to establish justice and restore faith. The prophecy includes specific details about signs that will precede the arrival. In Mesoamerican traditions, the Mayan calendar includes cycles with significant transitions. Some scholars argue that these cycles mark expected periods of transformation or return. The specificity of the calendrical calculation suggests something more than vague spiritual hope. In indigenous traditions worldwide, similar patterns of expected return appear. Spirits or beings from beyond who left but are expected to return. Specific conditions that will signal the return. Prophecies maintained across generations despite cultural changes. The consistency of this pattern across unconnected traditions is remarkable. Not identical prophecies, because each tradition adapted them to its own framework and values, but fundamentally similar in structure. Beings or forces from beyond human control will return. Specific conditions will signal that return. Transformation or restoration will follow the return. How do we explain this consistency? One explanation is that all humans naturally hope for divine intervention. We naturally project our hopes into the future and imagine rescue from current difficulties. There's psychological truth to this explanation. But the specificity of these prophecies goes beyond generic hope. They're tied to particular astronomical events, specific circumstances, particular timeframes. The level of detail suggests something more than vague hoping. It suggests information passed down with intention. Expectation maintained deliberately because specific sources suggested a return would occur. If external knowledge was being transferred to human civilizations, including knowledge of visitors' departure, wouldn't it make sense that the visitors would also communicate that they would return? Wouldn't they establish expectations in the cultures they influenced? Wouldn't they maintain those expectations through prophecy and teaching? The prophecies of return suggest that human populations were given information about future return. Not hoped for return, but anticipated return. Expected by specific circumstances. Prophecy maintained across generations because it was believed to represent genuine communication about future events. The fact that we're living in the era when many of these prophecies describe conditions for return is significant. The technological development, the astronomical events, the various circumstances specified in different traditions, many are being fulfilled in our current era. Whether this represents actual proximity to prophesied events or coincidental fulfillment remains open to interpretation. But the consistency of the prophecies and the specificity of the expectations suggest something more than random human psychology. They suggest information that was deliberately preserved. Information about future events. Information important enough to maintain across millennia, despite cultural change and transformation. The prophecies themselves become evidence of something. Whether that something is genuine foreknowledge of future return or shared cultural memory of contact. The patterns are undeniable. Civilizations maintain these expectations. They preserved the prophecies, they passed them down with care. They treated the expected return as significant enough to shape spiritual and cultural frameworks across centuries. The phenomena that ancient peoples documented haven't stopped. They've simply become less frequent or less visible in contexts where they're taken seriously. Modern civilization has become skeptical of reports that previous generations treated with solemnity. But the phenomena continue, and when documented by credible sources with advanced instruments, they remain unexplained by conventional science. In 1947, something crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. The initial military statement said it was a flying disc. Within hours, that statement was retracted and replaced with explanation of a weather balloon. The reversal was dramatic and deliberate. What the military initially identified as a disc was suddenly a balloon. The evidence collected was sealed. The witnesses were instructed to remain silent. The entire incident was classified. Decades later, declassified documents revealed that the military had indeed recovered something at Roswell. What exactly remains classified? But the initial identification as a disc and the subsequent cover-up suggests something more than whether balloon debris was recovered. More recently, military pilots operating advanced reconnaissance aircraft have documented unexplained aerial phenomena. These aren't casual observations or misidentifications. These are military pilots trained in observation, operating sophisticated instruments, corroborating each other's observations. In 2004, Navy pilots off the coast of California recorded an object that descended from 28,000 feet to sea level in less than a second. The object then moved horizontally at speeds that contradicted known physics. The pilot's observations were corroborated by radar data. The instruments confirmed what the pilots witnessed. Military officials acknowledged the phenomena were genuine and unexplained. The objects demonstrated capabilities that contradicted known aeronautical physics. Similar incidents have been documented repeatedly. Military pilots worldwide have reported similar phenomena. Each incident is individually investigated and individually remains unexplained by conventional science. Collectively, they suggest something systematic is occurring. What makes modern observations significant is the credibility of the witnesses and the quality of instruments used. These aren't amateur observers or casual witnesses. These are trained military personnel using sophisticated technology. The documentation is rigorous. The corroboration is extensive. Yet the phenomena remain unexplained. The conventional response is that the phenomena must be misidentification of known objects or natural phenomena. Mirages, optical illusions, atmospheric effects, misidentification of conventional aircraft, all possibilities individually. But collectively, these explanations strain credibility. Military pilots trained in identifying aircraft are unlikely to mistake conventional objects for anomalous phenomena with such consistency. The phenomena continue to be documented. Sightings increase in certain regions and decrease in others, suggesting something systematic rather than random. The incidents cluster around certain locations: military installations, nuclear weapons facilities, areas of scientific significance. The clustering suggests intentional surveillance or monitoring rather than random appearance. More significantly, the phenomena documented in modern times show characteristics similar to phenomena described in ancient texts. Objects moving with apparent intelligence. Rapid changes in velocity and direction contradicting known physics. Capability to remain stationary in defiance of gravity. Apparent observation or monitoring of human activity. The consistency between ancient descriptions and modern observations suggests continuity. Either the same phenomena have continued across millennia, or descriptions of ancient events have influenced modern interpretation of recent phenomena. But the consistency is striking enough that it cannot be easily dismissed. What becomes apparent is that unexplained aerial phenomena are real. They've been documented across centuries. They continue to be documented in modern times with increasingly sophisticated instruments. They remain genuinely unexplained by conventional science despite rigorous investigation by military and scientific organizations. The question isn't whether these phenomena exist. They do. The question is what they are and what they represent. Ancient peoples attempted to document and understand them. Modern observers continue to attempt documentation and understanding. The phenomena persist, unexplained, challenging our assumptions about what's possible in the world. If visitors existed in ancient times and possessed capability far exceeding human capability, why don't they intervene more obviously now? Why has contact become less frequent and less obvious, rather than increasing as human civilization advanced? The questions point towards something profound about the nature of potential contact and the constraints that might govern it. One possibility is that advanced civilizations operate under principles of non-interference. Just as we attempt to preserve indigenous cultures by minimizing outside intervention, perhaps advanced civilizations maintain similar protocols about non-interference with developing civilizations. Contact and knowledge transfer might be limited to specific circumstances and specific timeframes. Beyond those circumstances, the developing civilization is left to progress independently. This would explain why contact appears to have decreased. The teaching period ended. The knowledge was transferred. The civilization was left to develop independently. The principle would be similar to a parent raising a child, providing guidance in early stages, then gradually withdrawing as the child develops independence. The question of free will becomes relevant here. If visitors were actively managing human development in ancient times, were humans developing autonomously or being directed? The answer probably involves both. Humans were provided with knowledge and guidance, but the implementation was left to human initiative and intelligence. Humans received teachings, but had to choose whether to accept them and how to apply them. This balance, providing knowledge without removing human agency, is the most effective form of mentoring. It respects the autonomy of those being taught while providing needed guidance. It allows for independent development while offering acceleration through transferred knowledge. As human civilization matured, perhaps the visitor's role changed. Rather than active intervention and teaching, they shifted to observation and limited contact. The civilization was being tested. Could humans sustain and develop the knowledge they'd received? Could they advance further independently? How would they exercise their agency and autonomy? From this perspective, modern decreased visibility of contact represents respect for human development and autonomy. The knowledge has been given. Now, humans must prove capable of advancing it independently. The visitors might continue to observe and monitor, but overt intervention is withheld to preserve human freedom and responsibility. This interpretation accounts for several observable patterns. The decrease in obvious contact coincides with human civilization becoming more sophisticated. The knowledge provided in ancient times wasn't further advanced. It remained knowledge humans could understand and work with. The prophecies of return are consistent with a limited contact. Visitors promised to return, maintaining hope, but didn't intervene continuously. Another possibility is that contact patterns changed in response to human behavior. If humans proved destructive or incapable of responsible use of advanced knowledge, visitors might have withdrawn or limited contact. Historical records show repeated cycles of civilization rising and falling, often through conflict and destruction. Perhaps visitors observed these patterns and adjusted their approach accordingly. Yet another possibility is that something changed in the external circumstances. Perhaps the visitor's own situation changed. Their reasons for being present on Earth might have changed. Their ability or willingness to maintain presence might have decreased. Something in their own history or development might have made continued contact impossible or impractical. What remains clear is that contact patterns changed. Intensive contact and teaching in ancient times decreased to minimal or covert contact in modern times. Something shifted. Whether that shift represents intentional withdrawal, changing circumstances, testing of human independence, or something else remains unknowable. But the shift itself is significant. It suggests that contact, if genuine, wasn't constant or unchanging. It suggests strategic decisions about when and how contact occurred. It suggests that the visitors, if they existed, had purposes and constraints governing their interaction with humanity. Understanding the nature of those purposes and constraints might illuminate why contact patterns changed and what conditions might affect future contact or interaction. Everything presented throughout this investigation points toward a simple but profound realization. Our understanding of human history is incomplete. Whether that incompleteness reflects overlooked human achievement, forgotten capability, or genuine external contact remains open. But incompleteness is undeniable. The evidence, textual, archaeological, artistic, and astronomical, creates a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Ancient civilizations possessed knowledge and capability exceeding what conventional history acknowledges. That knowledge appeared suddenly without documented developmental process. That knowledge was preserved and maintained across generations. That knowledge continues to intrigue and puzzle modern observers. What this incompleteness means for humanity depends on what we choose to do with it. We have several paths forward. One path is continued denial. We can maintain that conventional history is essentially correct. We can explain away anomalies as coincidence. We can dismiss ancient texts as mythology. We can maintain that human achievement was entirely independent, and that the apparent mysteries will eventually be explained through conventional means. This path requires faith that current understanding is sufficient. Another path is rigorous investigation. We can examine the evidence without preconceived conclusions about what should have happened. We can question conventional explanations when they seem inadequate. We can follow evidence where it leads rather than where tradition suggests it should lead. This path requires genuine intellectual openness. A third path involves recognizing that multiple explanations might be partially correct. That ancient people possessed remarkable independent capability and received external knowledge. That human achievement was extraordinary and enhanced through guidance and teaching. That understanding human history requires integrating multiple forms of evidence rather than forcing everything into a single framework. Regardless of which path we choose, certain implications become clear. If ancient civilizations possessed knowledge we've underestimated, then human potential might exceed what we currently recognize. If knowledge was transferred to human populations, then humans are capable of integrating external knowledge and advancing civilization based on it. If prophecies of return have foundation in historical contact, then future contact might be possible and potentially imminent. These implications suggest that preparing for the future requires more than technological advancement. It requires consciousness expansion. wisdom development, alongside knowledge accumulation, cultivation of the capability to recognize and integrate extraordinary information without losing rational thinking. The investigation itself becomes a form of preparation. By examining evidence seriously and considering possibilities beyond conventional frameworks, we develop intellectual flexibility. We practice thinking across established boundaries. We prepare ourselves to recognize and understand extraordinary phenomena if they occur. The ancient peoples we've examined throughout this investigation were apparently prepared for contact through knowledge transfer and cultural integration. Their monuments suggest they anticipated communication with something beyond their immediate world. Their texts suggest they preserved information for purposes beyond immediate practical utility. Their prophecies suggest they expected future return. If we're approaching an era when such contact might occur again, either through visitor return or human achievement of contact capability, then the investigation we're engaged in becomes preparation, learning what our ancestors knew, understanding what ancient peoples experienced, recognizing patterns that might recur, preparing ourselves intellectually and spiritually for possibilities beyond conventional expectation. The path forward involves integration, taking what conventional history teaches us about human achievement and integrating it with evidence of ancient knowledge and capability, respecting both rigorous science and the testimony of ancient sources, maintaining rational thinking while remaining open to genuine mystery. The investigation continues, and in continuing it, we prepare ourselves, not for invasion or conquest, but for expansion of understanding and recognition of our place within a cosmos that might be far stranger and richer than we've assumed. This is the moment in the investigation where we must honestly confront what conventional science actually does explain well. To do otherwise, to dismiss legitimate scientific achievement and understanding, would be to engage in the same dogmatic thinking we're critiquing in orthodox history. Conventional archaeology has credible explanations named for many of the phenomena we've discussed. The pyramids, while architecturally impressive, were built using methods that, while difficult, are genuinely achievable with ancient tools and organization. Modern experiments have demonstrated this repeatedly. Workers using copper chisels, wooden sledges, and rope can move massive stone blocks. The process is labor-intensive and requires coordination, but it's not impossible. The precision of ancient construction, while remarkable, can be explained through advanced mathematical knowledge and careful measurement using tools readily available to ancient peoples. Rope and plumb lines allow for accurate measurement. Mathematics allows for calculation of angles and proportions. Patience and systematic methodology allow for achievement of precision without advanced instruments. This explanation is reasonable and supported by evidence. The astronomical knowledge attributed to ancient peoples could have developed through careful observation over generations. The precession of the equinoxes, while slow, would become observable if records were maintained carefully across multiple centuries. Multiple cultures could independently develop similar astronomical knowledge through similar observation processes. This isn't required to acknowledge that independent discovery is possible. Regarding ancient texts, linguistic analysis suggests that divine beings and sky visitors were common metaphors in ancient languages. Humans naturally use metaphor to describe things outside their normal experience. Ancient peoples likely created mythological frameworks to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. This is how mythology typically develops. The explanation is psychologically plausible and consistent with how human cultures typically function. The Nazca Lines can be explained as serving local ceremonial purposes. Evidence suggests they were viewed and appreciated from ground level by local populations. The perspective-dependent visibility from aircraft might be coincidental rather than intentional. Cultures invest in monumental projects for spiritual reasons that might seem disproportionate to practical function. This isn't unique to the Nazca Lines. Confirmation bias represents a genuine psychological phenomenon. When examining large bodies of evidence, humans naturally see patterns they're looking for. If searching for connections between ancient cultures, we notice similarities and minimize differences. If looking for evidence of external contact, we interpret ambiguous evidence as supportive. This psychological tendency is real and should be acknowledged as a potential factor in how we interpret evidence. Statistical analysis suggests that coincidence is more probable than we often recognize. When examining thousands of ancient structures globally, some will inevitably display similar alignments simply through chance. When studying multiple ancient cultures, some similar concepts will develop independently through universal human psychology. The probability of these coincidences is higher than we might intuitively estimate. The conventional scientific framework has genuine explanatory power for much of what we've examined. To deny this would be intellectually dishonest. The pyramids were built with ancient methods. Mathematical knowledge could develop through observation. Mythological frameworks emerge naturally in human cultures. Coincidence and independent discovery are statistically plausible. Where conventional science struggles is not in explaining individual phenomena, but in explaining the convergence of multiple phenomena across disconnected cultures. It can explain one astronomical alignment as coincidental. It struggles when multiple cultures achieve identical alignments separated by thousands of miles and centuries. It can explain one culture inventing mythology about sky visitors. It struggles when multiple unconnected cultures preserve similar specific accounts. The strength of conventional science is detailed explanation of individual phenomena. Its limitation is acknowledging when the accumulated pattern suggests something beyond individual explanations. This isn't a weakness of science itself, but of how scientific thinking is sometimes applied. True science should acknowledge when individual explanations, while each plausible, collectively suggest a larger phenomenon requiring broader explanation. Having acknowledged what conventional science explains well, we must now identify what genuinely remains mysterious, what conventional explanations struggle with, what evidence resists comfortable incorporation into established frameworks. The precision of astronomical alignments across multiple sites is explainable through observation and mathematics. But why would ancient peoples invest such enormous effort in achieving precision far exceeding practical requirements? Agricultural purposes don't require alignment accuracy within 0.05 degrees. Ceremonial purposes don't demand internal passages encoding mathematical principles. The investment seems disproportionate to documented purposes. The Nazca Lines serve no documented local purpose. The conventional explanation that they were ceremonial sites, viewed from ground level, doesn't fully account for why specific patterns were chosen. Why create geometric shapes? Why create animal figures? Why create patterns requiring such effort? Why similar patterns appearing across the globe in cultures that supposedly had no contact? Modern military observations of aerial phenomena with sophisticated instrumentation remain genuinely unexplained by conventional science. Navy pilots with advanced instruments recording objects performing impossible maneuvers can't be easily dismissed as misidentification. The data is rigorous. The corroboration is extensive. Yet conventional science offers no satisfactory explanation. Knowledge gaps in the historical record represent genuine absences. Where certain sophisticated knowledge appears suddenly in multiple cultures without documented developmental process. While incomplete historical records might explain isolated gaps, consistent gaps across multiple cultures and knowledge domains suggest something more than archaeological incompleteness. The consistency of ancient accounts describing similar visitors, similar technology, similar behavior patterns across cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time requires explanation. While humans naturally create similar mythology, the specificity of these accounts, descriptions of beings with particular characteristics, vehicles with particular capabilities, purposes, and behaviors consistent across cultures, suggests documentation of something observed rather than purely invented mythology. Ancient artistic representations of anomalous subjects rendered with precision and repeated consistency across cultures suggests intentional documentation rather than random imaginative creation. Artists, dedicating effort to precise depiction of unusual imagery, suggests they were attempting to communicate something they observed or learned about, rather than merely creating fantastical art. The sudden appearance of architectural precision in the oldest monuments, followed by gradual decline in later constructions, contradicts the expected pattern of improvement through increasing knowledge and experience. This pattern, greatest achievement earliest followed by decline, appears across multiple civilizations and suggests something different than gradual independent development. Sacred sites globally sharing characteristics of geographic prominence, astronomical significance, and visibility from the air suggests deliberate selection beyond what pure coincidence would produce. The clustering of humanity's holiest sites in locations with these specific characteristics seems too consistent to be accidental. The prophecies of return appearing across unconnected religions and traditions with sufficient specificity to be more than vague hope suggests information deliberately preserved. Specific conditions, specific circumstances, specific timeframes mark these prophecies. The consistency across traditions suggests something more than independent hopeful invention. Physical artifacts demonstrating capability in ancient times, the Baghdad Battery, crystal skulls with impossible precision, ancient lenses with optical sophistication, represent tangible evidence of knowledge we've underestimated. These aren't interpretable or ambiguous. They exist. They demonstrate capability. What becomes clear is that between what conventional science explains adequately and what conventional science cannot explain exists a significant gap. A gap large enough to suggest that something important is missing from our understanding. Not proof of anything specific, but undeniable evidence that investigation is warranted and that dismissal without investigation represents intellectual avoidance rather than scientific thinking. The most intellectually honest position is one that acknowledges genuine uncertainty. Not weakness or confusion, but clear recognition of what we know what we don't know, and what remains genuinely ambiguous despite investigation. We can state with reasonable confidence that ancient peoples possessed greater capability than conventional history typically acknowledges. The evidence for this is strong. Archaeological findings from sites like Göbekli Tepe, artistic representations of technical sophistication, and architectural achievements all support this conclusion. This represents reasonable confidence based on substantial evidence. We can state with reasonable confidence that knowledge gaps exist in the historical record. We cannot fully explain how certain knowledge appeared in human civilization or how certain capabilities were developed. These gaps are documented and acknowledged even by conventional archaeology. This is reasonable confidence based on evidence of absence. We can state with reasonable confidence that unexplained phenomena continue to be documented in modern times. Military observations, civilian reports, and scientific investigation all confirm that genuine aerial phenomena remain unexplained by conventional science. This is reasonable confidence based on rigorous observation and instrumentation. We cannot state with certainty that extraterrestrial contact occurred in ancient times. Despite compelling evidence suggesting something extraordinary happened, definitive proof remains absent. The evidence permits the conclusion, but doesn't require it. Alternative explanations, while individually strained, collectively represent possible interpretations of the data. We cannot state with certainty that visitors will return or that prophecies of return represent genuine foreknowledge. These remain possibilities worth considering, but evidence for them is indirect and circumstantial rather than direct and conclusive. The intellectually honest position is to acknowledge these distinctions between what we can state with reasonable confidence and what remains genuinely uncertain. To maintain openness to possibilities without insisting on certainty. To follow evidence while acknowledging that evidence can be interpreted multiple ways. This position of healthy uncertainty requires several commitments. First, commitment to continued investigation rather than premature closure. The evidence warrants serious study rather than dismissal. Second, commitment to following evidence wherever it leads rather than filtering evidence through predetermined conclusions. Third, commitment to intellectual humility, recognition that our current understanding might be incomplete or partially incorrect. It also requires resistance to two temptations. Resistance to the temptation toward dogmatic skepticism, insisting that nothing extraordinary could have occurred and dismissing evidence without genuine engagement. This temptation often masquerades as scientific thinking, while actually representing faith that current frameworks are complete. Resistance also to the temptation toward dogmatic belief, accepting ancient astronaut theory as proven truth rather than as a compelling possibility requiring continued investigation. The space between these temptations is where genuine thinking occurs. In the middle ground between impossible and proven, we find worth investigating. This is where the most productive intellectual work happens. Healthy uncertainty maintains openness to evidence that challenges established understanding while maintaining rigorous critical thinking about that evidence. It permits wonder and mystery while resisting unfounded speculation. It acknowledges gaps in our knowledge without rushing to fill them with convenient explanations. This investigation itself represents healthy uncertainty in practice. We've examined compelling evidence. We've acknowledged legitimate counter-arguments. We've resisted easy conclusions in either direction. We've remained open to possibilities while maintaining critical thinking. The result isn't certainty. It's invitation to continued investigation. It's recognition that genuine mysteries remain. It's acknowledgement that our understanding of human history and human potential might be incomplete. It's commitment to following evidence seriously rather than dismissing it reflexively. This intellectual stance, humble, curious, rigorous, and open, represents the most honest approach to genuine mysteries that resist easy resolution. Everything humanity believes about itself flows from stories about where it came from. These aren't merely historical facts divorced from meaning. These are foundational narratives that shape how civilizations understand themselves, what they believe possible, and what they value. For centuries, Western civilization told itself that humans were created in the image of divine beings. This narrative shaped values emphasizing human dignity, individual worth, and moral responsibility. It created frameworks for understanding human purpose and meaning. It influenced how societies organized themselves and what they believed humans could achieve. Then the narrative shifted. The theory of evolution suggested humans descended from animals through natural selection. This represented a fundamental reorientation of human self-understanding. We weren't specially created, but were part of nature's evolutionary process. We shared ancestry with animals. We were products of natural forces rather than divine intention. This shift had profound consequences. It changed how humanity understood itself. It influenced religious frameworks, moral systems, political ideologies, and personal psychology. The new narrative shaped civilization's development across the subsequent centuries. Now imagine another shift. What if the investigation we've been conducting reveals that neither narrative is fully accurate? What if humans are neither purely created beings nor purely evolved animals, but rather beings who received significant knowledge and guidance from advanced sources? What if our development as a civilization involved interaction with external intelligence? This wouldn't diminish human achievement or worth. It would contextualize it differently. Just as a child who learns mathematics from a teacher demonstrates intelligence and capability through mastering and applying that knowledge, ancient peoples who received knowledge from advanced sources demonstrated remarkable capability through comprehending and implementing that knowledge. The shift in self-understanding would be profound. We would recognize ourselves as recipients of knowledge, as beings capable of learning from advanced sources and integrating that knowledge into our own civilizations, as participants in something larger than ourselves, as inheritors of knowledge that predates our independent development. Different civilizations have responded differently to receiving external knowledge. Some integrated it brilliantly, building upon it and advancing it further. Others stagnated with it, failing to develop it beyond what was received. This suggests that the capability to receive external knowledge and develop it independently is itself a form of intelligence and achievement. The recognition of this capability has implications for how we understand human potential. If our ancestors could comprehend and implement advanced knowledge, then humans possess remarkable capacity for learning and adaptation. If that capacity was expressed in ancient times and then lost or diminished, then recovering it might unlock potential we've forgotten. Our current crisis of meaning in secular societies, disconnection from frameworks that provide purpose and belonging, might reflect loss of the narratives that once connected humans to something larger than themselves. For millennia, humans told stories about cosmic visitors, divine guidance, and celestial connection. Modern rationalism dismissed these stories as primitive superstition. But what if we've lost something meaningful when we abandon them? What if the investigation into ancient astronaut theory, whether or not it proves specific contact occurred, represents recovery of connection to something larger than ourselves? What if the real value isn't establishing definitive proof of visitors, but recovering sense of genuine mystery and cosmic connection? A narrative that includes the possibility of ancient contact wouldn't require abandoning scientific thinking or rational methodology. It would require expanding our frameworks to include possibilities beyond current conventional models. It would permit wonder and mystery alongside rigorous thinking. It would allow for human achievement and external guidance simultaneously. The narrative would shift our self-understanding. We would see ourselves as beings with remarkable heritage and untapped potential. We would recognize ourselves as capable of learning and integrating extraordinary knowledge. We would understand ourselves as connected to something larger than our immediate civilization. This shift in how we understand ourselves would affect everything. How we organize societies, what we believe possible, what we value and prioritize, how we treat each other and our world. The foundational narrative shapes everything that follows from it. If the investigation we've conducted reveals anything, it's that the future might hold possibilities beyond what conventional frameworks permit us to imagine. The past suggests multiple potential futures, each with different implications for how we prepare. The first possibility is return. If visitors existed in ancient times, and if prophecies of return represent genuine foreknowledge, then we might be approaching an era when contact resumes. The prophecies across traditions point to specific conditions that would signal such return. Some of those conditions appear to be emerging in our current era. Preparation for such return wouldn't mean military readiness or defensive measures. It would mean consciousness expansion. It would mean developing our capability to recognize and integrate extraordinary knowledge. It would mean cultivating wisdom alongside technological advancement. It would mean preparing ourselves psychologically and spiritually to encounter intelligence and capability beyond our current understanding. This preparation would involve asking difficult questions. How would we respond to contact? What would we learn? How would we integrate new knowledge with existing understanding? What responsibilities would contact create for us? These questions matter not because contact is certain, but because thinking through possibilities prepares us for them. The second possibility is independent achievement of contact capability. As human civilization advances technologically, we might develop the ability to detect and communicate with advanced intelligence if it exists. We might achieve spacecraft capability that allows us to venture beyond Earth and encounter other civilizations. This scenario inverts the power dynamic. Rather than waiting passively, we would reach out actively. This future requires us to prioritize wisdom development alongside technological advancement. History repeatedly shows that advanced capability in the hands of immature consciousness becomes dangerous. Nuclear weapons created by societies not yet capable of global cooperation. Artificial intelligence developed by humans still driven by tribalism and conflict. Genetic engineering capability emerging before ethical frameworks mature enough to guide it. If we're to achieve contact capability responsibly, we must develop consciousness that transcends current limitations, wisdom that extends beyond national borders and tribal loyalties, understanding of our shared humanity and shared destiny, cultivation of values that prioritize creation and cooperation over destruction and conflict. The third possibility is recognition of our own forgotten potential. Ancient peoples accomplished extraordinary things, not necessarily through external knowledge, but perhaps through capability we've lost or diminished. If we could recover understanding of what humans are capable of, we might unlock potential dormant within our current civilization. This possibility suggests that the most important contact might be with ourselves, recognition of human capability, recovery of lost knowledge, development of consciousness and wisdom we've allowed to atrophy. The greatest achievement might not be learning from external sources, but remembering what humans have always known. These three possibilities aren't mutually exclusive. Elements of all three might prove true simultaneously. Contact might occur while we're also developing independent capability, while also recovering forgotten human potential. What they share in common is that preparation involves similar work: expanding consciousness, developing wisdom, learning to think beyond current frameworks, cultivating integration of knowledge alongside spiritual development, preparing ourselves to recognize and understand extraordinary phenomena if they occur. The investigation itself becomes preparation. By examining evidence seriously and considering possibilities as beyond convention, we practice intellectual flexibility. We develop capability to recognize patterns and connections. We prepare ourselves to understand possibilities if they manifest. The future will reflect what we choose to prioritize now. If we continue dismissing mystery and insisting our current understanding is complete, we'll miss opportunities for genuine advancement. If we become dogmatic believers in alternative explanations, we'll lose rigor and truth-seeking. But if we maintain healthy curiosity combined with rigorous thinking, we prepare ourselves for possibilities we cannot yet imagine. The past suggests the future might be stranger and richer than we assume. Preparation means remaining open to that possibility while maintaining intellectual integrity. We've reached the end of this investigation, but only in the sense that we've completed an examination of evidence. The investigation itself continues. It continues in every mind that considers the evidence seriously. It continues in every scholar who studies ancient texts without the filter of predetermined conclusions. It continues in every scientist who maintains genuine openness to phenomena that resist conventional explanation. The evidence we've examined is substantial. Ancient texts describing visitors and transferred knowledge. Archaeological sites demonstrating precision and capability we've underestimated. Artistic representations showing consistency across cultures. Astronomical knowledge appearing suddenly without documented development. Modern observations remaining unexplained by conventional science. These don't constitute proof of extraterrestrial contact, but they constitute evidence worthy of serious investigation. We've also acknowledged what conventional science explains well. It accounts for much of what we've examined. The pyramids could have been built with ancient methods. Mythology could have developed through human imagination. Astronomical knowledge could have emerged through observation. Coincidence and independent discovery are statistically plausible. These explanations have genuine merit. We don't dismiss them. But the convergence of evidence from multiple independent domains textual, archaeological, artistic, astronomical, modern, observational, suggests something more than individual explanations. The pattern itself is what demands attention. The consistency across cultures, the specificity of details, the apparent impossibility of coincidence. These patterns point towards something systematic rather than random. What that something is remains genuinely unknown. We've presented possibilities. Ancient astronaut contact represents one possibility. Forgotten human capability represents another. Independent discovery of similar knowledge across cultures represents a third. Multiple interpretations remain plausible, but the investigation has revealed that legitimate mystery exists. Something we don't fully understand actually happened in human history. This investigation matters not because we need definitive answers about the past. It matters because we need to recover something we've lost. The capacity for genuine wonder, the willingness to acknowledge mystery without forcing false certainty, the intellectual flexibility to consider possibilities beyond established frameworks, the humility to admit when conventional explanations are inadequate. Modern civilization has become too quick to explain, too confident in current understanding, too dismissive of mysteries, too eager to force everything into frameworks that seem comfortable and established. This investigation represents recovery of something essential, genuine curiosity combined with rigorous thinking, wonder combined with methodology, mystery acknowledged alongside investigation. For those watching or listening to this investigation, the question becomes personal. What will you do with this evidence? Will you dismiss it reflexively because it challenges established understanding? Will you accept it uncritically because it resonates emotionally? Or will you investigate it rigorously? Will you examine ancient texts yourself? Will you visit ancient sites and consider what you observe? Will you think carefully about the evidence rather than accepting others' interpretations? The investigation doesn't end here. It ends in your own engagement with evidence, in your willingness to think critically without demanding false certainty, in your openness to possibilities while maintaining intellectual standards, in your commitment to following evidence wherever it leads rather than where tradition suggests it should lead. The mysteries of ancient history remain genuine mysteries. But now, their mysteries we can investigate seriously. The evidence exists, the patterns are verifiable, the questions are legitimate. What remains is commitment to genuine investigation rather than dogmatic defense of either established narratives or speculative alternatives. Thank you for investigating with us. The mysteries persist, but now you're equipped to investigate them yourself. The evidence is available. The patterns are visible. The questions are yours to pursue. And in pursuing them, you join a long lineage of humans asking fundamental questions about who we are, where we come from, and what we might become. That investigation, conducted seriously and rigorously, might be the most important work we can do.